Control does not always sound controlling. Sometimes it sounds loving, soft, protective, devoted, even romantic. And that is exactly what makes it dangerous, because some of the most controlling phrases in a relationship do not arrive as threats. They arrive as care, as concern, as affection, as words that sound comforting on the surface, but quietly take away space, freedom, and emotional balance underneath. That is the pattern. The sentence sounds warm, but the function is control. And when control wears the language of love, people lower their guard. They do not hear domination. They hear closeness. They hear attachment. They hear someone who cares deeply. So they excuse what feels uncomfortable. They ignore what feels restrictive. They tell themselves this is just what love sounds like. But healthy love does not need to shrink you in order to keep you close. And that is the difference this video is about. Because some phrases sound loving while slowly training you to feel guilty for having boundaries, independence, privacy, or your own emotional space. In this video, we are breaking down 7 phrases controlling people use to sound loving, what those phrases really do beneath the surface, and how to tell when affection is being used as a disguise for power. The first phrase is, "I just worry because I love you." This one sounds gentle, almost sweet. It sounds like care, and sometimes it is. But in the hands of a controlling person, this phrase becomes a tool, because it turns their anxiety into your responsibility. Now your independence becomes a threat to their peace. Your freedom becomes something you are expected to manage carefully so they do not feel uncomfortable. That shift matters, because real love can feel concern without making you responsible for regulating someone else's fear all the time. Control cannot. Control uses worry as permission. Permission to check, to question, to monitor, to limit. And if you push back, they do not say they want power. They say they are scared because they love you. That is why this phrase is so effective. It makes control sound protective. The second phrase is, "I only want what's best for you." This one sounds wise, supportive, even selfless. But listen closely to what it can hide. Because sometimes what is best for you just happens to look exactly like what gives them more comfort, more influence, or more control. Now your choices are no longer judged by whether they are right for you. They are judged by whether they fit the version of you that feels safest to them. That is a problem, because this phrase can quietly replace your judgment with theirs. And once someone positions themselves as the person who knows what is best for you, disagreement starts to feel like immaturity. Resistance starts to feel reckless, and obedience starts to feel like trust. That is not love. That is guidance being used as authority. The third phrase is, "No one will ever love you like I do." This phrase is powerful because it sounds intense, special, once in a lifetime, but underneath it often carries a darker message. You will not find better. You should feel lucky. You should be careful not to lose this. And once that message lands, fear enters the relationship. Not fear of harm necessarily. Fear of losing the one person who supposedly loves you in this rare, unmatched way. That fear is useful to controlling people because it reduces your options in your own mind. It makes you tolerate more, doubt yourself more, stay longer, excuse more. And the phrase itself sounds romantic enough to avoid suspicion. That is the trap. What sounds like devotion may actually be isolation in a softer voice. The fourth phrase is, "I just need to know where you are." On the surface, this can sound practical, caring, reasonable, and in healthy relationships, sometimes it is. But in controlling dynamics, this phrase rarely stays simple. It grows. What begins as check-ins becomes expectation, then access, then entitlement, then surveillance. Now it is not about knowing where you are. It is about whether you are allowed to exist without reporting yourself. That is a huge difference, because love does not require constant proof of your location in order to feel secure. Control often does. And this is where many people get confused, because the phrase itself sounds small. But repeated enough, it teaches you that privacy feels suspicious. And that is one of control's favorite moves, to make normal independence look like distance, and normal privacy look like disloyalty. The fifth phrase is, "If you love me, you would understand." This phrase is one of the most efficient guilt tools in a relationship, because it takes love and turns it into pressure. Now the issue is no longer whether something is fair, healthy, or reasonable. The issue becomes whether you love them enough. That is emotional blackmail in a very polished form, because love gets used as the test you have to pass. If you say no, you seem cold. If you hesitate, you seem selfish. If you protect a boundary, you seem like the one who is failing the relationship. That is why this phrase works. It turns emotional compliance into proof of love. And once love becomes something you have to prove by abandoning your own needs, control is already winning. The sixth phrase is, "You're all I need." This sounds romantic, pure, deep, like devotion without limits. But when controlling people use this phrase, it can carry a hidden demand. Be everything. Meet every need. Do not pull away. Do not have too much of a life outside of me. Because if you are all they need, then your independence starts to feel like rejection. Your outside relationships start to feel like competition. Your alone time starts to feel like abandonment. That creates pressure fast, because now you are not just a partner. You are an emotional lifeline. And that role is too heavy for love to carry in a healthy way. Love can be deep without making one person responsible for becoming someone else's entire world. Control cannot tolerate that distinction. The seventh phrase is, "I'm only protective because I care." This is where control often becomes easiest to hide, because protection sounds noble, loving, responsible, and sometimes genuine protection is real. But controlling people often use the language of protection to justify restriction. What you wear, who you talk to, where you go, what you post, how visible you are. What begins as concern becomes permission to manage you. And if you resist, they do not frame it as control. They frame it as love trying to keep you safe. That is why this phrase is so dangerous. It makes restriction sound virtuous. And once restriction sounds virtuous, the person being limited may start feeling guilty for wanting freedom. Now, here is what all 7 phrases have in common. None of them sound openly controlling. That is the point. They sound loving enough to pass. And because they sound loving, they are harder to question, harder to challenge, harder to name. Because people expect control to sound harsh, cold, aggressive. But a lot of the time, it sounds soft, attached, concerned. That is why so many people miss it in real time. So how do you tell when loving language is actually control? Start with this question. Does this phrase bring closeness or does it reduce freedom? Healthy love may ask. Control expects. Healthy love may care deeply. Control uses that care to claim access. Healthy love leaves room for privacy, individuality, and disagreement. Control interprets those things as threats. That difference matters. Because the issue is not whether the phrase sounds kind. The issue is what the phrase does. Does it invite trust? Or does it create guilt, obligation, and emotional pressure? Does it respect your autonomy? Or does it quietly train you to feel bad for having your own life? That is how you hear the truth beneath the tone. Another sign is repetition. One phrase in isolation may not mean much, but a repeated pattern tells you everything. If loving words consistently leave you feeling smaller, watched, guilty, or responsible for someone else's emotional stability, pay attention. That is not just affection. That is affection being used to shape your behavior. And once that starts, the relationship becomes less about connection and more about management. That is the shift you have to watch for. Not just what they say, but what their words slowly train you to become. More careful, more apologetic, more available, more explainable, more dependent. That is not what healthy love is supposed to do. Healthy love makes room for your full self. Control makes room only for the version of you that feels easiest to contain. And that is why these phrases matter. Because they sound so normal, so caring, so easy to excuse. And yet, underneath, they can hide possessiveness, guilt, fear, pressure, and quiet domination. Once you learn to hear that difference, something changes. You stop judging phrases only by their softness. You start judging them by their effect. And that changes everything. Because the moment you stop confusing control with love, you protect something important. Your boundaries, your freedom, your judgment, and your right to be loved without being slowly reduced in the process. If this video made you hear loving phrases differently, subscribe to the channel and keep watching. And if any of these sounded familiar, there is a good chance the next video will explain even more than you expected.